Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the parallel session on barriers to inclusive transport policy and to look at how we can begin to overcome some of these barriers. This session is jointly hosted by the DFID-funded High Volume Transport Applied Research Program and the Research for Community Access Partnership, which is commonly known as RECAP. This session is going to be 90 minutes long. My name is Charlotte McClain-Nhlapo, and I'm the Global Disability Advisor for the World Bank Group, and I'm going to be the moderator for this session. So I just wanted to reflect back on the plenary session this morning, because I thought it was very interesting that the issue of accessibility was pretty central in the discussion. And so in many ways, that's very encouraging. But it also was quite interesting to see the diverse interpretations of what accessibility means. And I think for persons with disabilities, there's a particular aspect of accessibility that we think about when we talk about accessibility. So notwithstanding the variations in how people understand accessibility, for me, one of the key or the common narrative that came out of this morning's plenary was that accessible transportation is essential for economic development. And we know that accessible transport is also important in terms of developments connecting. It's a connector for people connecting to people. It's important for people connecting to spaces. It's important for people connecting to markets, people connecting to opportunities, a whole host of opportunities. But it also has to be reliable, and as stressed by Etienne Crook, it needs to be safe. So I think thinking about all of those components is really important, and hopefully something that my colleagues will discuss this afternoon. So we have a really distinguished panel this afternoon, and I'll introduce them in a bit. And they will talk a bit about some of the policies, but perhaps more importantly, some of the innovative practices that are happening in this space and really beginning to change the landscape in terms of looking at accessible transport for persons with disabilities. Some of the things that we do know is that persons with disabilities experience significant transport disadvantage in how they access, again, services, markets, education, and other types of opportunities. And we also know that transport barriers are very, very diverse. It could be in terms of vehicle design. It could be in terms of location. It could be in terms of poor road conditions. It could be in terms of inaccessible signage. So there are a whole host of factors that apply to the inaccessibility of transportation for persons with disabilities. And that's an important point to just pause and think about for a moment, because I think what typically happens is that we think of accessibility as providing ramps, and it has to be much more than that. We also know that having access to transport, accessible transport for persons with disabilities, helps people to live independently. And that's where we want to go. We want to go to people living in the communities and people living independently. And so having this transportation systems is important. We also know that retrofitting infrastructure and transportation is really, really expensive. And what often happens is it doesn't happen. And we wait until we purchase the new fleet of whatever that is. And so the retrofitting option is really not the best option out there. So to start the discussion, I just wanted to highlight a couple of big global architectural pieces that frame the discussion around inclusion of persons with disabilities in relation to transportation and other issues. But most importantly is the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities that has now been ratified by over 180 something countries. And the chances are very high that your country has ratified this convention, which means that your countries are legally bound to ensuring that Article 9 in the convention addresses issues around accessible transportation. And then we have the Sustainable Development Goals. And within the Sustainable Development Goals, we have Goal 8, Goal 11, that makes specific reference to affordable, accessible, and sustainable transport systems. And so it's important for us to pull from these global architectural pieces and use those to frame our interventions and our programs. So let's get started with the experts, because they are actually the experts on transport and not I. And so we're really fortunate to have a great panel here today. And so we have Nite Tanzarn, and Nite is a development management specialist with a keen focus on gender. And so she's going to be speaking to us. We have online Ms. Daniela Bass. I'm not sure if she can hear us, but Daniela is a director at the UN in the Department of Social and Economic Affairs. And then we have James Bradford, who is the Global Product Director with iRAP, right at the end. And then next to James, we have Mohammed Yousuf. And Mohammed is the Program Manager with the Accessible Transportation Technologies Research Initiative. And next to Mohammed, we have Jamie Leather. And Jamie is the Chief Transport Sector Group Specialist.
Just the chief.
Just the chief. Just the chief, that's super important. And he covers the Asia region. So we have a great variety of speakers here and hopefully a very good sense of different explorations on this important issue. So what I thought I would do is to kick off this discussion with a question. And my question is, what can be done at an international and regional level or national level to change some of the mindsets and increase the understanding of ensuring that transport is indeed accessible for all? And maybe I want to start with James right at the end.
Yeah, this is an interesting one, and almost don't want to go back to that classic quote we've heard time and time again from Michael Bloomberg, which is, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it, and you can't fix it. And so we've got to make sure we've got ways of being able to measure it, so we can actually understand where we're at and what we can do differently. So a good example of this is actually from road safety, where we've got our star rating protocol, and that's been used time and time again. So some of the World Bank projects that have been done in India, they're using it as part of the design process. So what they're doing is they're building it right first time as part of it, rather than a traditional project where you give the engineer almost a cost requirement built to this budget, a speed requirement, a flow requirement, and off they go. They design the road, and then you end up with a road that kills people. They also then put in a safety requirement. It's, well, why can't we do that same? Yeah, I know it'll have challenges. Why can't we do that same kind of approach to make sure that, like you say, when the road's built, it's built right first time. You don't have to retrofit features to it. The other one is things like, we know the resources are out there. You just have to look at things like the NACTO guide, the Global Street Guide. And that's got really useful pieces of advice in there for actually making infrastructure more accessible. We've got to make sure these resources are known about and are in people's hands. They're taken through the workshops. So they were doing a workshop on Sunday at TRB, and the amount of difference that was happening of people going in the room and just, they thought they were playing around with road designs and with cutouts of road features, but in reality they went out, changed and educated. So it's about, like you say, changing mindsets and looking through a different set of lenses. The other one I wonder about is, can we learn things from other industries? If you go and do some research into how someone like Ford designed their cars, what they've got is they've got this special suit that you can put on that has like glasses on it that's slightly foggy to represent an old person's eyes with cataracts, gloves that are really thicker so they almost represent you've got arthritis, and then they get their designers to use their cars, and they go, well, no wonder you're having a problem, because you experience the car through your own body, and be able to put yourself in somebody else's shoes, and it's, could we do something similar to the designers who are actually taking through what is the experience, somebody with like impaired eyesight, or maybe someone autistic and they're struggling with the noises that are happening around them. Can we shift how they view the situation?
So really focusing on people-centered design, but when we think about people-centered design, thinking about all people. Because I think a lot of companies think they do people-centered design, but they tend to focus on a particular set of people. So Nite, your thoughts on that?
Okay. So related to that is it's important to count, because what is counted is measured, is visible, and once it's visible, then people become aware of the issues. One of the challenges is that we don't know the numbers. Some countries don't even know the number of persons with disability. I've done several studies where you want to design something or to promote equitable development, different aspects, and you talk to the policymakers and they say, what is the issue? What are the numbers? We don't respond to corridor rumors. And so, and one of I think the challenges is that many people around here have been involved as activists, as researchers, academics, in trying to promote equitable or inclusive transport. And the fact that we are here today discussing that is an indicator that we have to some extent failed. And why have we failed? I think one of the reasons is because there is lack of empirical evidence. I mean, a lot of research has been done. Micro-level case studies, studies that are not quantitative in nature. So because of that, there is lack of disability, sex, and age disaggregated transport data. And so it's difficult to respond to that without that kind of information. I've been working on gender for the past more than 20 years. And every time you go for a meeting, it's the same people you present. Probably around this here is people who are interested in inclusive transport. And if the people that we talk to are people who are already interested, then actually, how do you challenge the status quo? How do you dismantle that dominant narrative? So I think there's a need for us to change the way we organize, the way we mobilize, in order to be able to create awareness, because I suspect everybody around here is on board. So whose mindsets do we want to change? And how do we go about changing those people's mindsets?
So very provocative and really important. And I think for me, it's a bit of a glass half full, half empty, because in some ways we want to make sure that there is this visibility. And so that's an issue, but I absolutely agree. Jamie, maybe you can say a bit about, from a regional perspective, given your work in Asia, what is it? How do we change some of these mindsets?
Thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation to be part of this panel. It's a great honour. I just wanted to cover sort of the international and the regional and the national, if I may. You mentioned the SDGs, and SDG 11 has been set. That is fantastic, because it sets at the national level the commitments from the government. But I think, as just was said, how is that translated to action? And that's where we're going to see the realities of change. It's been mentioned about the data to put that there, but unless we clearly define what activities should be done to meet those targets, and it's very unlikely we'll move forward or move in the right direction at the speed we should be doing. But to your question more specifically at the national or the regional level, it's good to make sure we put it in context. Now, our head office is in Manila, Philippines, which is a middle-income country or a rapidly developing country, but it's a world apart from Washington, D.C. And when I travel around the region, it is staggering, the difference between developed countries and developing countries. Now, relevant to this discussion, you can, I don't know, Enrique Penalosa has said this before, but you can tell by the sidewalks or the pavements if you're from the UK. If you can actually get around from A to B on a sidewalk, you're probably in a developed country. If you're walking in the road with everybody else and the vehicles, then you're probably in a developing country. It's that starting point, and that is important at the regional context. Where we are and where we want to get to. So I was suggesting SDGs have set the ultimate objective. in certain places we may be here and it's relatively easy to move there, but in the vast majority of the developing countries, we are a long way from that. So how do we sort of go about changing that mindset? I think it's been said before, the mobilization of the civil society, but I also believe that there's a lot of technology involved that could help with this, and I think that would allow us to make some of these changes. Maybe jumping to one of the solutions if I could, but it was from a slightly different perspective, but it just demonstrates how technologies could be used to make things more accessible. Japan has a very aging population, also very advanced with a lot of technology. Now, most of their pedestrian crossings are adaptive to the person crossing that street. So if they notice how fast or slow someone is crossing the street, they will give them more green time. So I think some of these things, and obviously that's a sort of case by case, but those are the tools that will become increasingly available. And we shouldn't be saying, well, that's what we do and we design it this way and we've always done it that way. I think we have to embrace the different options as well. Sorry, it may not answer precisely, but I think SDG at the highest level, but then putting that into the local context, explaining where the ultimate objective is and what are the incremental steps that we need to get there, because nothing is going to be solved overnight. It's a long process, unfortunately.
Yeah. But I mean, I think you raised the point around intentionality, right? Making sure that you actually put in place what needs to happen.
Yes.
So Mohammed, you live in Washington, D.C., and you work on some interesting projects around this. So how have you changed mindsets? What's been your experience?
Yeah, first off, thank you for having...
Do you want to put your mic on?
Thank you for having me here. It's an honor to be on this panel. I actually want to start off with the mindset. We have gone through a whole process over the last so many years, But one thing that we lack is a lot of times when we have data in the countries that we have and the lack of in other countries, as Nite you spoke of, there is a discourse mostly on showing the negative aspects of disability and what it means, in various communities and societies. We need more ways to show the positive aspects of what this change or how this is going to make an impact. There needs to be more equity discussions and numbers, such as one thing that really was helpful for me as we were doing this study of helping travelers with disabilities with a focus on technology and bringing a synergy of technology solutions to help enable a point A to point B type of journey. Was this study that was done along with Microsoft, Accenture and others, which really put a number on a shift of 1% of unemployment in disability. What would that equate to? They come up with a number of $25 billion hit to GDP per year for 1% of shift in unemployment. I guess if you look at transportation from a person like me with a disability lens, there are 3 or 4 key aspects to that. Education, employment, recreation, and healthcare. In the work that we have done so far, I have not come across a number that equates these 3, 4. Not only at a developing country, but other countries which have really access to data and other aspects. Once we have that, I think there is, in terms of changing the mindset, there needs to be more, as I said, on the positive aspects, the awareness piece. And maybe the way I see, this is the first time I have been at a conference of this magnitude where so many different aspects of development around the world was discussed. I see there is a disconnect from those who are advanced to less, and there needs to be maybe an alignment of different needs and how we all can come together. Like you said, we are not going to be able to solve this overnight. This is a long issue where you need a lot more stakeholders at the table.
Great, that's great. So can we maybe just think a bit about how we better understand the cost of car crashes? And how road crashes and resulting injuries, how do we cost for that both economically, but also how do we cost for that socially? And what's the data that's out there that the panel knows about Is anybody doing any work in this space? And maybe, if not, what should we be doing more of? James?
Yeah, this is an important issue, and certainly it all comes down to the data and the availability of data. And so what we do is we'll often work with crash data, but it's often all you get is the number, or you get a bit of a breakdown, but what you're getting is police data, and what the police are looking for is somebody to blame. They're not necessarily looking for what could we do differently, what's the impact of it. One of the key pieces of work we've been doing over the last few years is actually with TAC, so it's the State Authority of Victoria in Australia. And so they've got a slightly different model. Rather than each person insuring their own vehicle, TAC actually as a state insure all the vehicles. So they've got a unique data set that actually traces it from the crash right the way through to what was the outcome. And so we've been working with them with our protocols, looking at what the risk is on the road, but more importantly, how does that translate into different crashes? What's the outcome of those crashes? So in amongst that data, there's about 120,000 claims through the data set we've been looking for. Some of the interesting bits coming out of it, over half of those claims were associated, or the cost of them, were associated with long-term care. The 60% of those claims were coming after 2 years after the actual crash happened. And because often what we'll do is we'll get this perspective slightly wrong of, well, what's the worst outcome of a crash? But actually, it's an ongoing thing. It's got a long tail after it. And also through that data, we've been seeing interesting patterns, like a quarter of them were actually severe brain injuries. And I think it's only when you can actually start digging into that level of detail on the data that you start getting interesting twists on it and what the real consequences of the crash are. But all of those costs I've been talking about are just the economic ones. They're not even the social ones. It's like, how do we grasp on understanding what the social impact of it is?
Yeah.
And how do we change this? So that, with TAC, it's easier because they're the monopoly provider of insurance. How can we replicate this around the world where actually you're dealing with multiple insurance companies and not always the best collected data in the world?
So I saw a lot of heads nodding on the panel as you were talking. So any ideas from Mohammed, Jamie? Nite?
You asked, are there any?
James and Mohammed need to turn off their mic. There we go.
Still not on that.
You're on.
I'll shout. But people are listening. I'm on. Oh, thank you. You asked for good examples. I think the best one in terms of the socio-economic cost has probably come out of this building. In early 2018, the World Bank released something on the cost of road accidents, and that shows how little cost could be put in and such huge benefits. But it comes back to your first point: how do we give that message in a way that the decision makers or those that can act on it will really happen? But I think the data is there. Slight variations depending on your locations, but whether the data is there or not, WHO have made estimates what it should be. World Bank has very good data on what the cost is of each of those interventions to address the issues. But the missing point is getting the buy-in from those that will move this agenda forward, and that's where I think we all should be pushing to try and make sure it does happen. Because I think the information is there.
Yep. Mohammed?
So I just will add that, like, the data is there, but there may be a new way to present that, and you could now use some of the artificial intelligence and other models to maybe visualize that. I think a lot of times, like even in my current role now, we have a lot more data than that we could process or handle. We are looking into use of some of the newer tools, so maybe like using AI and some of the fusion approaches, like technology, to visualize that, that will perhaps give you a different aspect, of looking at from a visual point of view.
So I'm not sure if Daniela's connected. Daniela, can you hear us? Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I am from the beginning.
Wonderful. Welcome.
Okay, I'm there. I would like to add something about both this question and also the first one that you asked colleagues, what can be done. Now, as far as it concerns the social and economic costs of road crashes, some of the panelists mentioned the WHO, and so assessing the costs of road crashes and resulting injuries, both economically and socially, is under the mandate of WHO, so they might have some interesting data to share with us. And WHO regularly publishes information on the cost of road crashes and resulting injuries. And every year, the lives of approximately 1,035,000 people are cut short as a result of a road traffic crash. And between 20 and 50 million more people suffer non-fatal injuries, with many incurring a disability as a result of their injury. And talking about data, key, absolutely. So we can say that road traffic injuries are the leading cause of death for children and young adults among the age of 5 and 29 years old. And 93% of the world's fatalities on the road occur in low and middle income countries, as our colleague underlined. In many developing countries, if you have to walk, you walk on the road, where there are also cars, etc., etc. So of course, it's much easier to have a car accident there, even though these countries have approximately 60% of the world's vehicles. And then I could go on with data and statistics by saying that according to their last data in WHO, road and traffic crashes cost most countries 3% of their GDP. And this includes economic and social costs, including cost of medical treatment, lost productivity due to injury or death, and then for family members who needed to take time off work or off school to take care of the person who is injured. Now, we know, as somebody said, that there is the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development that has been adopted 5 years ago, 5 years ago by the UN members, that is 193 countries. And this agenda has a set ambitious targets, as we know, with 17 goals. And one of the targets is indeed to reduce the death and injuries caused by road traffic crashes. And the ambition was by the year 2020. So we have 300 and how many days left?
60.
Well, actually, we have to keep in mind that February this year has 29 days.
That's
so we
also
have at our disposal. So WHO is the lead agency in this, in collaboration, of course, with United Nations Regional Commission, as we mentioned, the regions. And when it comes to road safety within the UN system is WHO, that chairs also the UN Road Safety Collaboration, and indeed serves as the Secretariat for the Decade of Action for Road Safety 2011-2020, so still this year. When it comes to the first question, what can be done? If there is time, I can add something later on, but in short, I would like to say that we have the 2030 Agenda with its goals. We have, as you said, Charlotte, at the very beginning, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, if we focus on persons with disabilities. And let's keep in mind, disabling conditions or disabilities can be temporary or permanent. So our mobility can be reduced temporarily or permanently. Say that a person has to wear a cast because broke the leg. That's a temporarily that person has reduced mobility. So it's much more than the classic definition or way of thinking of a person with disability and transportation. Much more than that, or an older person. So besides these, we have other key agendas. There is the Addis Ababa agenda with, its chapter on financial inclusion. So when we talk about financial inclusion, particularly for vulnerable groups of people, indigenous peoples, persons with disabilities, youth, or even all these members in the family, well, when we talk about financial inclusion, what about financial inclusion vis-a-vis making transportation accessible and inclusive to all? So the private sector, cooperatives, etc., how are they benefiting or contributing to this We have the 2063rd Agenda in Africa. And that's also another important one, another important tool that we have. We have the climate change agenda. When there is a natural disaster, we needed to have transportation well done, infrastructures well done, and they have to be accessible and inclusive if we want to try to save lives or not to have additional people with injuries caused by a natural disaster because you can't catch the train or you can't leave or the roads are not safe, etc., etc. And then when we think of more a global level, what can the United Nations do? What are we doing? The UN family. So
Daniela, can I ask you to hold on that thought, and we'll come back to that in a bit, because what I'd like now is to just recognize the fact that, we've spoken a bit about some of the problems, right? We know that there's some major barriers. We know that there are frameworks that are supportive of inclusive transportation and accessible transportation, but perhaps we can pivot to a discussion that's more focused on what are some of the key drivers for inclusive transport, and maybe Nite, you could kick us off on that.
Thank you.
It's okay, just there you go.
Okay. All right. Yeah, so in my view, the key drivers are the people, or they should be the people. And these are the people that are typically socially excluded from transport. Because if you're talking about inclusive transport, it's talking about these people's lived realities. You can't talk about inclusive transport if you've never been a woman, pregnant, with a child, scrambling for a multi-purpose truck in a rural area, probably with a load. You can't talk about inclusive transport if you've never suffered a disability, that because the means of transport available, are not appropriate, they serve as a barrier to your travel. You can't cross a road because you can't see the cars or you can't hear the sound of the cars. You can't talk about inclusive transport if you've never lived in a rural area where all your travel are on community roads. You can't prioritize community roads, the footpaths, the bridges, and all, if that is not your lived reality. So, and this is an example, so many parents, they lose their children because of a swampy crossing. A child is going to school, they drown. Just that. So if you've never experienced that, you cannot. And so the drivers should be these people who have, because they're excluded, they're voiceless, persons with disability, some women, excluding me, some men, older persons, people in rural areas, people in heart-rich areas, people suffering all kinds of man-made and other disasters. And so if you have to give voice to the voiceless, that means that you have to put people, like you said, at the center of policy and planning. It means you'd have to adopt a human rights approach to transport planning. An approach that embraces or embodies actually all these human rights instruments that we've been talking about. An approach that promotes people's participation, empowerment of these socially excluded people, accountability, not in the form of money, but being accountable to their mobility and accessibility needs, non-discrimination, and of course, equality and equity.
Great. I would only add to that I think the issue around dignity is also central to looking at transport and ensuring that transport is appropriate. But I was wondering if other colleagues at the table had any ideas around some of the key drivers for inclusive transportation. And also just wondered a bit about how, I mean, it's great to say we should have people at the center. So any examples of how that might have happened in the work that you do? Any one of you want to take a shot at that?
I'll try to, but it's very difficult to follow what was just said because I think it was very eloquent and covered many of the aspects. All I could add 2 points. One, with those people who are in power to make the change, what do they understand by inclusiveness? It has many dimensions, as was put forward. If they set clear agendas or have a vision, if my city needs to be livable, what does that mean, and which parts of society need what to make sure that my city is livable? If I want to ensure rural accessibility, what is required within my vision for that? I'm a strong believer in visions as opposed to master plans, and by master plans I mean a shopping list of investments or actions that need to happen. If you set your criteria for a livable city that no one's left behind, it's 20% of your disposable income is spent on travel, your commute time is less than 30 minutes, whatever mode you may be taking, it's a mode share of 70-30, public transport, non-motorised against private. That sort of a vision can be the driver, and every time a decision is taken, you look back and say, is it aligned with my vision, with those criteria? And I think that is one way of changing the mindset. Because we tend to get in, sorry, I'm talking from the sort of infrastructure provision side here, we tend to get trapped into what do we need to build to solve the solution. And in many cases, you can't build your way out of the solution. Yeah. You have to adapt, as you were saying. It's very costly. So we need to adapt what we're getting and move in that direction, but setting clear criteria, what you are trying to target and how you want to achieve that, and set that measures for it.
Mohammed?
I may just add, in our case, what had helped or what worked was having a precise message, but getting it to the highest authorities, in front of the leadership, and engaging them to be the champions, and once you have that buy-in, it is much more easier then to bring people to the table and have discussions, so maybe having the mayors or the governors, like at the highest level, and having their buy-in, would go a long way.
James?
Not much to add, but the question that keeps coming back to my mind, like the rhetorical question, is, what are the disbenefits of inclusive transport? Or, because almost we're designing to the minimum. It's just like we should change our mindset. It's like there aren't any disbenefits.
Right.
It should be the norm. It should be the standard.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like when you were saying about building as we've always built. Why do we keep getting into this mindset? How do we break ourselves out? What's the driver to change that approach?
Daniela, any thoughts from your end?
Yes, thank you. Well, we are repeating more or less the same thing because we know that we have to start from there. I couldn't agree more with Nite when it comes to training, if you wish, or raising awareness through the civil society NGOs at local level. Starting from there, since often from national down to local is difficult to reach people at the grassroots level, persons with disabilities themselves.
Yeah.
I say we since I am also a wheelchair user, we have to be aware that there are rights and there are policies. Because if there are rights but there are no policies, rights cannot be implemented. So first we have to push in order to make sure that we have strong social policy frameworks in place at national level, and then it's a little bit easier to have the rights implemented. But we can start with the rights in terms of raising awareness. I have the right. And explain what the requests, the needs, and some possible solutions are, so to be heard. And we often talk about changing the mindset, referring to the planners, the policymakers, etc. I would strongly recommend that we have to help people with the disabilities to change their mindset, to become, agents of change, as we usually say. So how are you going to be an agent of change? Mainly asking for your rights to be implemented, yes. But then an actor of change is leading also processes. So to do that, persons with disabilities have to be given the instruments, the knowledge, how to do that, whom to get in touch with, who can support them in this. This is how I see it. Awareness raising, therefore, in both ways, also among practitioners, is key and is crucial to make sure that then accessible design principles are implemented, even in the small village or the small country in the middle of nowhere in the country. And then there is the need to be consistent. Consistency and joint approaches with planners, persons with disabilities, and governments is essential. And again, we have to benefit of the strong civil society networks we have. We have to benefit of what the United Nations offers. That is, when we have a space, a convening space. So let's utilize this convening space for keep repeating what is needed. Let's be consistent also from that viewpoint, so that governments then finally can really play the key role they should play. They need governments, they need to provide policy leadership to create a climate within which inclusive planning is seen as the norm, as colleagues have just said, and as a standard to be met. And so the governments then need to create the legal and financial frameworks within which we can include accessibility as a norm. And therefore, adopting accessible standards has to become a norm. And this will have an impact also on affordable transport, not only inclusive, but also affordable transport of persons with disabilities who are often not well educated, who are often not employed, and therefore they're often poor. Yeah. So what do we do with inclusive transportation if we do not have the money to buy the ticket? Then you won't see enough people with the various kinds of disabilities using inclusive transportation. So then there will be the excuse that nobody uses it.
Right. So I think, thanks, Daniela. I think what we've heard is that, the rights are definitely there. There are a fair number of frameworks that recognize the importance of accessible transportation. We've also heard about some of the gaps in terms of the data. We have heard very eloquently as to what some of the drivers are for accessible and inclusive transportation. And so maybe we should I think this is a great segue for us to think a bit about what can we do? How do we as international financing institutions influence this change at country level? How do we embed this in our discussions with ministries? And I'd like you to think about this practically. How do we make sure that we are also talking about low-income countries? And then I think there's this often niggling thought as to whether we should be ensuring that we put accessibility as a non-negotiable condition in all of our investments. Is that something that's realistic? Is that something we should be thinking about? Jamie.
Thank you very much. I'd like to start by saying it's, in terms of the question, what influence can the international financial institutions? I'm from the Asian Development Bank, one of the regional banks, and we're here in the World Bank. We are in a very privileged position, I would suggest. And in a way that we finance things, we finance policy, we finance investments, we finance actions in the developing world. And the reason I say privilege, we get access to key decision makers at ministerial level or above that you may not normally get access to if you said you wanted to provide something or support something. In my former life, I was private sector looking at building toll roads, building railways, and you didn't get the sorts of access that we do within that financial community, both multilateral and bilateral. So with that comes a little bit of a challenge as well. We must, by our shareholders, whether it's World Bank shareholders or Asian Development Bank, we must follow their directions. They are quite clear. We have to add value to what we're doing. And that's where I think we can provide the work. and the support, but we also have to do something that is relatively new or first time within the country. Now, we have heard that there's lots of data or good practices like iRAP that is available, but I think where World Bank ourselves or the other regional banks and the bilaterals, they come in, maybe it's the first time that country is doing something. So it gives us the opportunity to embed the accessibility components or the inclusiveness components within the first metro project in Vietnam, as an example. If we don't get it right the first time, it's very difficult the second time or the third time, and we heard about retrofitting in terms of road safety. It's a privilege and it's an honor to be able to have that access and do that work, but we must make sure we do get these things right. So that's just sort of the broader, and that could apply to energy or transport or any of these components. Moving to the second bit about the should it be non-inclusiveness, be non-negotiable condition of all our assistance. Again, I would stress we need to be a bit mindful what we mean by inclusiveness. It will mean many different things to many different people and in different country contexts as well. I guess I would say, to put it very bluntly, it would be hard to put it as a non-negotiable at this point, but that's not to say we shouldn't be pushing the boundaries as far as we go on every single time we have a discussion with people. Whether that's gender, whether that's disabilities, we should always go. I'd liken it to the road safety. The ultimate objective is Vision Zero. Not a single life should be lost on the roads. That's what we're all aiming for. Universal access is what we're all aiming for, but how we get there and to achieve that on every single project across, say, the entire public transport network from the start may not be possible, but it is the ultimate objective and we should be doing that. Now, many people may not like to hear that, but if we went that way, I do fear that some of the discussions may not go as far as we'd like. So it's perhaps a bit confrontational thing to say at this point, but I'm stressing that the vision is to get for this universal access, but it may mean very different things to different people. So whether to put it in as a loan condition or a loan covenant in financial speak from the institutions, it has its pros and it also has its cons, and we must look at both of those, but again, striving towards to achieve the best and add that value, particularly if it's the first time we're doing something in country. But happy to answer questions when we get round to that.
I'm sure you'll have questions on that. Mohammed, your thoughts, just given some of the regulatory framework in the US, maybe you can reflect on the fact that it is in fact written into most projects in the US.
Yes, in fact, Jamie, to what you said, those are some of great tools, something that could be leveraged. What was also interesting is in the recent times, I must say, like last year, there was a legislative mandate to a new type of technology, which is automated vehicles, but a higher level of automation. And how that could be used, the term we were using was a market failure, meaning there is no incentive for market to go to those communities or those solutions. And how could government incentivize such areas? There was a $60 million worth of money or budget that was assigned to this, which led to creating a different type of solicitation, which actually has not only different aspects of accessibility, but even the market failures for going to different regions which otherwise will not be tapped. This led to actually a very successful demonstration grant review, which led to 6 different projects being funded across the US, including actually 8. And I think 4 or 6 of those has a different accessibility aspect.
Yeah. Daniela, I was wondering whether you had any thoughts on the issue around having inclusion as a non-negotiable condition. I suspect you do.
I do have a few. I wish I could convince the 193 countries. Yeah, I would like to add a couple of things, but talking about transportation, when it comes to cars, automatic cars, etc., or these cars that drive with using artificial intelligence, I'm not sure, but I was told by a group, an NGO accredited to the Economic and Social Council of Ministers, which is from Israel, Access Israel actually, and they mentioned to me that these new cars are designed, or those at least they were aware of, in such a way that a wheelchair user might have real difficulties in getting in and out, etc., etc. I'm not sure if that's true, but if that's true, I'm really concerned. And now, close parenthesis, but it would be interesting for me to know. Otherwise, we start building, we encourage the private sector to start, those who produce cars, to start producing these new cars that are not really usable by all people who might wish to drive. As for what we can do as United Nations, okay, I can think of what the department I work for and with is doing. It's a department that is part of the United Nations Secretariat and serves most of the key intergovernmental processes, and then decide what's going to be the next step, mandates and resolutions. So I go back to the space that we have. So by supporting the intergovernmental processes and mechanisms, what we are trying to do is to make sure to strengthen the international normative frameworks on disability, in this case, for instance, or others we have, in collaboration with other UN entities. So if this could be done together also with the banks, key banks, like the two representatives that are sitting at the table now, and I'm talking about you, Charles, and James, this would be fantastic. So we have now a decade of action, right? It started in 2020 up to the year 2030. So how can we create partnerships that go 17 in this sense and push more, being persistent, using the international intergovernmental bodies that we serve, and then also your bodies, because each bank has also its own bodies, but in a kind of more coordinated manner. This is the second point. We should work in a more coordinated manner together, strengthen that aspect of our work, without stepping on each other's mandates, but strengthening and supporting each other's mandates. I see that something is nodding, James, and nodding the head. I am an optimistic by nature.
She's omnipresent.
All guys, you can't see me, but I and then through the voluntary funds that we have here at the United Nations, for instance, now we have another thing which is called resident coordinators. Now, through the resident coordinators, we can also try to reach the various ministries to make them understand what maybe from the global hasn't reached the national and the global level. So let's use also the resident coordinators. We have them now. We had them also before, but now also the Secretariat is engaged besides UNDP. And then the last point, inclusion requirements by the international financial institutions and aid partners can encourage inclusive solutions. This could also lead to a larger production of inclusive solutions, and this would maybe help to lower costs in the long run. Because we know it's often cheaper to build inclusive solutions from the start. Now, I like the idea of having a dialogue, a debate, a brainstorming, call it as you want, about what inclusive transportation means for banks and for the private sector. That's fascinating.
Okay, so thank you very much. I think the only thing that I would add to this section of comments was that I think one thing that international financial institutions and development partners can do in terms of influencing this agenda is continue to build the evidence base around what works, begin to look more at the economics behind that, and really use it as a way to push out some of that knowledge and sharing that knowledge with partners and with our clients. So let's talk a bit more. Let's talk a bit now about legislation. Can it help? Does it help? Has it helped? Nite?
Okay, all right. Legislation, yes, it's very important, because then it becomes a statutory obligation to be inclusive. Just like with the conditionalities, then it becomes an obligation for the governments or whoever to do it. However, it doesn't work if it's an obligation where the people who are obliged to do whatever it is, to comply to that, are not aware, and that's why we keep on going back to raising the consciousness, people being aware as to why you are, as development partners, or even government is asking the implementers to do something. They need to be aware of that. I've seen on several occasions reserved seats for older persons and persons with disabilities, airport buses, wherever, and you find we sit, comfortably. Why? Because we're not aware of why that is being done, why the seats are being reserved. So as long as people are not aware, legislation may not help, whatever it is. And then the other thing is, there is legislation, but if there are no mechanisms in place to enforce compliance, then it does not work.
Yeah.
There are so many policies that are developing, legislation supported by development partners, very good ones, that collect dust. People are not aware. A consultant prepared the legislation or the policy, handed it over, and they shelved it. So you need to have legislation, a framework that is appropriate, that is enforceable, and can produce results. And this framework constitutes so many things that we've been discussing since the beginning of the session. One of them is that it has to be evidence-based. Sometimes policies or legislation are not based on evidence. Sometimes they're based on evidence from other countries, and that brings in the issue of context. I'm a consultant. I prepared a policy in whichever country. I'm contracted to prepare another one. I just change the name of the country. It's irrelevant. It will not work. So it has to be evidence-based. It has to be consultative. It has to be based on the needs and preferences of the end users. Consult. Most times they're not consulted. Even when they're consulted, the consultations, even when people are consulted, the consultations include people like you in meetings such as this. And these are spaces where the socially excluded people do not, they're never invited. Then the other thing is they should also be resource bound. You can't prepare a policy or a legislation without financial implications. Because if there are no financial implications, it means it will not be implemented. So most policies, most legislation, because you want to enforce, what do you need? You need the resources, human and financial and all. You didn't plan for them. And because you didn't think of planning for them, they will not be reflected in the budget. So the law or the policy is useless. And some legislation, we've talked about retrofitting some of the inappropriate or some of the policies that or legislation that is adopted from other countries where, like we are saying, retrofitting, which is very expensive. It comes in after you've done something. And then I like the concept of the pinking for the women because they'll love it. So you have the pink coaches. I'm not sure whether they work, but some of those things that work elsewhere, but not necessarily everywhere. What else did I have? Resource bound. You have to have the indicators to see actually whether what you set out to do is being done and with what results. And appropriate legislation, it has to promote what we've been saying since we started, the principle of affordability for everybody. There's so many people who have missed trips simply because they cannot afford the cost of transport. Principle of availability. Very many people in rural areas do not move because there are no means of transport. The principle of equal participation and equal representation. Socially excluded people need to have a voice. They need to have a seat at the table and not seats like with the UN. Where is the UN? Somewhere. You have the mainstream kind of agenda with the main issues and all, and then we have the NGO, whatever, sessions where we discuss issues that sometimes are not reflected. Okay, sometimes they are, most times they are not. So we actually want representation at the seat. And then the principle also of universality or inclusive design. If you have legislation that promotes all these, then it's likely to be to promote inclusive transport.
So I want to push and probe a bit on this point around legislation, because it strikes me that if a country has legislation or if a country has ratified the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities that requires you to actually legally mandates you to ensure that your transportation systems are moving towards being inclusive, then at minimum you should be thinking about that in your programming. I would argue that it's your responsibility to do an assessment that considers at minimum the legislation at country level. Thoughts?
On the legislation, I think you mentioned at the beginning the ramps as an example here. The transport system is only part of the entire journey. We can make universal access for a metro or a BRT, whatever it may be, but you don't work or live on the BRT or the metro. You're working in an office. Many of our countries have quite strict building codes. But the ramps you see, so every building in Manila will have a ramp, but it's at this sort of angle. Now, where is the legislation is there, but as you were saying, unless it's going to be enforced, but in this case it was in place. So tick the box, yes, they have a disabled access ramp. It's very inaccessible. There's no accessibility about a ramp at that sort of angle. But they have met the criteria, even though the criteria actually says it should be at this gradient. So it's the legislation in place, but I think the most important point is the enforcement of that and having governments with the resources, both in terms of personnel and time and ability to force those issues through, is really where this legislation issue has to be thought through. And it's only when it's implemented it's got any value. Just setting a law. That may sound a bit odd if you're coming from a country where there's sort of different laws, but usually it's there and it's been followed. But how it's followed and how it's intended is not necessarily how it is actually delivered at the end of the day, which is the serious issue.
Great. So I'm going to open up for questions because I suspect there are a few. And Peter, you want to go? And I did not ask Peter to ask questions.
No.
Just say.
More some remarks or just an idea of, I want to know your idea on some things. There was a lot on measurability of accessibility. When I give presentations, my first slide is there's no such thing as accessibility, it does not exist. It's something that's quite personal. It's quite personal, it depends on time, on place. Should we not go to a model where we have accessibility as a kind of quality, and the only thing, or the only people that could measure accessibility are the people who use it, and that's kind of a quality standard should always get higher and higher during time. It's not what generally is considered as feasible by engineers and so on, because they want rules. But I'm an engineer and I'm teaching system engineering. If you see those things as a system and start from what should society be? It should be something where everybody can participate in the most feasible way. If you take those things as just your non-negotiable condition of inclusiveness, I think you could achieve more than by just measuring heights of curbs and such things. And I think something is wrong with that really measurability focus. Is that there are things that you will never be able to measure. For example, there was a girl that gave me a brilliant example of what inaccessibility in a non-technical way can be. She was 25 years old, needed paratransit. Paratransit is you get a kind of your bus will or your van will come within the frame of 1 hour. So imagine you have a Tinder date, you don't want to be there, and in the end, or plan it that you will be already 1 hour late alone before you get home, or worse, that while you're there, the driver comes in and says, "Okay, I have to take you away." You should. That's inaccessibility of transportation, which you will never measure it in the normal measurable things we have. So I think one of the things that could solve that is big education of our engineers, of our policymakers on that focus on everybody counts. And if from your 18-year-old until you're 23 as an engineer, you are continuously formed in thinking in that way, I think a lot of problems should be solved.
Excuse me, I don't want to be rude in interrupting, but I can't hear you. If there is a microphone, maybe that would help. Daniela Bass from New York. Thank you.
Thanks, Daniela. Sorry about that. Is there there is a roaming mic. So any more questions? Oh, wow, great. There's a mic for those who can get up and go to the mic. That may be best. If not, we can get somebody, I'm sure, to bring the mic to you. Please say your name and where you come from.
Sure. Hi, Sveta Malisheva. I'm in the Development Impact Evaluation Unit here at the bank. Thank you so much to the panelists. I think it's a really important discussion to have. And one of the things that came up several times was on data. And I would actually challenge the panel because I don't think the data does exist, especially in the countries where we're all working. And we found when in a lot of our work, when we went to Kenya, we know there's 1,500 fatalities. But first of all, we know that's an underestimate. And we have no idea where are those fatalities happening, what is causing them, when are they happening. And that's what policymakers need in order to have more effective policy. And so it's taken a huge effort to actually try to get that information. So we've been working with the police to actually take these stacks of paper and turn them into usable information. We've been trying to use crowdsourcing. There's a lot of opportunities, but it is costly. It is also costly in terms of time and effort in order to do that. And so how do we get the governments to actually want to invest in this data? Because it does pay off. Through these efforts, we can now actually point to the 200 spots in the city of Nairobi where if they were able to focus, they'll decrease fatalities and crashes in half. And so it does pay to invest in that, but right now we found it very difficult to actually get the institutions to actually put the time and the money necessary to get the data they need to do better.
Great. I'm going to take 2 more questions and then come back to the panel for Mary.
Thank you. I'm Mary Cross from the International Transport Forum at the OECD. Thank you for this sharing of perspective. And it's very heartening to see that the bank is really taking on in a very, very serious way these questions related to disability inclusion. It strikes me that there is still very much a reasoning based on cost. However, and we can ascertain those costs and have been able to for a long time. These related to infrastructure development and development of equipment and rolling stock and the space around transport infrastructure. We can evaluate all of that. We know how to do that. The costs are understood in terms of the real direct costs anyway. Where there's a real lack of understanding is with regard to the benefits. And without a more concerted discernment of the benefits related to improvement of accessibility in the transport sector, it's going to be hard to make those hard market-based arguments. And I believe this goes to our colleague from the Asian Development Bank. Jane, I have to come back on that just a minute, because we've got all the rights, we've got all the imperatives for this. But the fact is, when you have to go and make the argument for the investment, and there's a market evaluation that has to take place, it does. So making those benefits very, very visible and very, very clear and very, very compelling is a hard task right now. And we at the ITF have started to explore that. We need to go further, because until we do that, it's going to be very hard for the lending institutions to really make those kinds of arguments, even though the imperative exists. And I would just end on one particular point, and that is that 20 years ago, ministers of transport in 43 countries, this was in the context of our predecessor organization, 43 countries came together around a statement that said that all infrastructure procurement in their countries, this was 20 years ago, all infrastructure procurement in their countries needed to absolutely take into account accessibility considerations and criteria. And we know that that's not the case now. So we need to look at the benefits. We need to focus on that so that the argumentation can lead to better investments. And that's what I would argue for, alongside the continuing communication and education of the imperative that exists without question on a rights-based basis. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to recognize Jeremy, and then I'm going to ask the panelists to respond and come back for a second round. I see you, Bernard, I see you, Anne, and I see you. Yeah. That's him over there.
Thank you, and thank you for making this a priority at TT. I've really enjoyed getting to hear about it. My name's Jeremy from UC Berkeley, and I guess one thing that was a takeaway from the workshop for transportation in developing countries at TRB was about the sort of importance of informal transit, and how about not wiping the slate clean necessarily, or formalizing in the ways that we may have in the past, and the importance of including them in some way. And I guess with that in mind, I'm kind of coming back to ask, we know that the retrofit is difficult and not necessarily the way to go, but the fact is a lot of cities are built, and there are informal transit systems now that are inaccessible, both in terms of people with disabilities, gender, older adults. So if you have a successful example or ideas you have going forward about how to adapt existing systems, particularly thinking about informal transit, maybe the station area around those accessible by design new metros and BRT systems, how do you change the existing framework?
Great question. Thank you very much. So I think Peter's question was comment was more of a challenge in terms of how we understand accessibility. And I think it's a really important one for us to take forward. And I think his point around ensuring that we're educating policymakers and we're educating engineers to think about accessibility differently, and in so doing, making sure that it's seen as part of quality assurance, I think is an interesting pivot for us to consider. But I think specific questions to the panel around data. how do we get governments to invest in this type of disaggregation of data, in these types of data points? And then a question from Mary around the reasoning based on costs. How do we move away from that? Looking at the fact, or recognizing the fact that we have all of the necessary interventions, so to speak, in place, but how do we move that agenda? And then Jeremy's point on retrofitting. So, Jeremy, I know you wanted to speak to Mary's point, so you may want to do that, and then we'll come back. And Daniela, let us know if you'd like to say something.
I just wanted to, I think I may have misspoken at the beginning about the data. I think there is data, but not to the level you described, which is the data we should be getting. What I meant to say is that WHO makes very good estimates of what a likely number of fatalities are. It's not pinpoint accurate, but they triangulate the police records, the hospital data, and the insurance data. As an example, if we want to see how, rather than saying what the problems are, hopefully we can talk about some of the solutions. Thailand had a great exercise. WHO released their information. Like many countries, Thailand was well below 50% or more. Rather than saying WHO is wrong, Thailand engaged with WHO, and WHO went to help them to try and improve their data collection. 2 years later, they released it. It was plus statistical variance. They basically had the right number. But that's at the macro level, which allows us to have the discussion to then go down to the micro level that you were talking about. But I think if there's this discrepancy, we need to get to there. So when I said the data's available, I was perhaps meaning more the theoretical data that WHO would produce to be able to have that discussion to get back up to a point on that. So that, at the beginning, I may have misled slightly. I was talking about some of that macro data is there to allow us to get to the other ones, which sort of comes back to the, if that data is there when we can have that cost-benefit analysis. And I thought the question may come back on there in terms of why we're investing or not. So what I said earlier, it pretty much comes down to cost. I think if we hear anything today or tomorrow or the earlier part of the week, it's about integrated transport solutions. When I said that if we put it as a non-negotiable conditions for universal access, clearly there's a cost implication for that. If it's a metro system, it's another few $100 million. If it's a VRT system, it's another few $100 million. At a relatively low-cost public transport, that could be another 20% on the capital cost. I don't know the exact numbers, but that would seem like a realistic cost. It's an additional 20% to make that particular transit system universal access. But that doesn't really solve the problem because the entire journey may not be accurate. Given that integrated transport solution, are there other options that would provide better directions towards universal access than making every single metro line, every single BRT, every single vehicle 100% access? I think the discussion, this is why I'm saying we strive for that goal. And ultimately, every single piece of infrastructure should be, but there are other ways of providing that access, despite it may be a more cost-effective, it's certainly not the ideal, but it's aiming towards there that the various groups in society are getting access, whether that's those who feel endangered walking to and from the stations. And I think this is the important part. The cost benefit, what I was talking about, that extra 20% on just the piece of infrastructure, it only takes one little barrier. The curb is 2 feet high, sorry. If that final part of the journey, then the entire journey is not possible. Some of these things are outside the scope of, certainly outside the scope of us, but outside the scope of the government. You're ending up, like those ramps I described, you're ending up in private property. So again, looking at different options for there, I think we need to, again, strive for the ultimate, but with the realization that there's a cost component. There may be other solutions that are more cost effective for the same benefit. But the entirety, and this is where I was talking about the vision, rather than just an individual piece of infrastructure providing the solution, we need to look at the entire city being livable, or the rural accessibility providing the type of access for all of those people in society. But don't think we have the solution. Look at the local environment and see what vehicles are there, how they're used, and are there other vehicles. There are good examples. Davao in southern Philippines provides taxis with special access at a reduced cost, so the affordability part's there. So there are a number of examples, even in the developing world, that are addressing this.
So any examples on the retrofitting piece?
Not on necessarily the retrofitting, but a similar example is exactly what they've done in South Africa, where they had a lot of informal taxis, these minibus taxis, and they were decades old, and they were death trapped, to be honest. And so they brought in the nudge tactic of saying, okay, well, if you buy one of these brand new vehicles, we will give you this significant discount on it. And other kind of tactics like that, where so the taxi driver, the informal taxi driver, it becomes an incentive for them to shift. Can we introduce similar things where we say, okay, we will provide you with this brand new vehicle, significant discount on it, and these other benefits because you've shifted to this accessible vehicle.
Mm-hmm.
The other one I almost wanted to reflect on is the combination of those 2 points, and I'd say almost your challenge of measuring it, and we can't do that. And I'd actually say probably the example you're giving about curb height is, yes, curb heights are important, but we might be looking at it from the wrong angle if we think that's it. Just because the measure may not exist at the moment doesn't mean we can't measure it. It's like the example with Kenya is when we've done work there, yes, the crash data was atrocious previously, and that's why we developed our star rating system that didn't require crash data to be able to understand where the risk of the drivers is for the pedestrians. Surely we could do something similar. Like as a cyclist myself, yeah, I'm unfortunately turning into a mammal, a middle-aged man in Lycra, and I view the road from one perspective. But it's only when somebody challenged me with the level of traffic stress and said, well, yeah, this road's appropriate to you, but it's not appropriate for your daughter to ride on it. Can we do something similar for accessibility so that we're not just looking through the lens of my eyes? I completely agree that it's a personal thing. We're not looking at it through my eyes, but we're looking at it through society's eyes. Who is?
My big point was that in the end, you should measure it by participation.
Yes, yeah, I'd agree with that.
So I'm going to take a few more questions. I'm going to ask everybody to be very brief because we are running out of time. We've got 5 minutes. So Janet, Bernard, and Anne.
Yes, I am Janet Jimenez, an access consultant from Mexico. And well, we know that many countries have signed the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. We know that in Article 9 it says about accessible transport. But what we need is implementation tools. And for example, one of those is that we don't have international standards of how vehicles should be on terms of accessibility. Mm-hmm. And actually, yesterday I was messaging with Amanda Gibbert, she's from South Africa, and right now she's trying to make a van accessible. And so since we don't have international standards, how to make that, I think, and in different modes of transport, now we have all these motor taxis. We know that many persons with disabilities use this type of mode to get out of their house because they know that the sidewalks are not accessible. So we need this. That's one thing. And then the second one, another tool, implementation tools, is that we need to plan the transport to be, in order to be an integrated system, we need to really plan it through stages. We know that to have a massive transport accessible, it will not be immediate, but maybe while we're making the massive transport accessible, we might have another alternatives for accessible transport.
Yeah. Bernard, right behind you.
Thank you, Jen. I'm Bernard O'Beaker, a high-volume transport applied research program. I'll try and make it one question, but it's really two questions. I agree with Mary in terms of the economic argument. Despite what we said, ultimately, one of the real important issues most clients and the decision makers will be is the economic argument. And I'd just like to put a slight change in terms of maybe it isn't that you said, for example, could it be a mandatory requirement for lending, for example? There's different ways you can make it mandatory. For example, can we... one of the key things one does for lending cases for road projects is to, as an appraisal, an economic appraisal tool such as HDM4. If we were to include inclusive accessibility as part of the economic appraisal, so you don't actually insist on sort of disability inclusive transport facility, you just insist on them providing you the economic case. And if that economic case includes inclusive transport, then you're done. You're done. So the question is really, it's articulating the data, the information that would allow them to carry out that evaluation. So the question is really about, in my view, about providing that data for them to include it, and it could be incorporated through such appraisal models as the HDM4. My second question is that Nite, you mentioned, and I think Daniel supported that in terms of persons with disabilities being real the agents of change. How can we empower people with disabilities to become those agents of change? What sort of support do they need, and how can we make it happen?
Great. Anne, very briefly, please.
So Anne Jocelyn with the UK's DFID. Last summer I had the privilege of being in a group of infrastructure advisors who visited London's Olympic site. And one of the things that they did, and I realize it's a developed country example, but one of the things that they did was put inclusivity at the very, very start of all of their thinking and all of their planning. And I think it's a fantastic example that it can be done. They put people with disabilities at the center of the thinking and the planning. They had extensive consultation and inclusion and all of that. And they came up with a result that, and I'm going to contradict you, Jamie, a little bit, but I realize that I'm saying this in a much broader context. They came up with a result that did not cost anything additional to what the site would have cost without including inclusion from the start. So it doesn't have to cost extra. Now, this isn't a transport example, so I'm not trying to contradict you. Now, let me get to my quickly to my question. I think the one thing that we haven't touched on, and this has been fantastic, we've touched on a lot, but the one thing that we haven't touched on is stigma and invisibility of people with disabilities in the countries where we work. And in so many countries where we're working, and the countries that we're talking about, people with disabilities are actively hidden. They're not even acknowledged that they exist. Now, we know the statistics say that they should exist, that they do exist, that they probably exist in greater numbers than they do in our developed countries, et cetera, but they're totally hidden. I'm not quite sure what the question is, but I wonder if you can comment a little bit about how we get at that, and we have to get at that before we can get at anything else.
Okay, great. So I've gotten the red light saying stop. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to gift my wrap-up comments to the panel, because I'm really, really generous, and ask the panel to each very quickly respond to one aspect of the questions that came up. So let's start with James. Daniela, get ready for a very quick response, and then we'll come down the table. James.
I'd like to come back to this gentleman over here and almost challenge you, saying if we were including it in something like HGM4 as we're recognising an economic benefit, I don't think it will be inclusive for all. I think you'll then cost people out. I think it needs to be an ultimate requirement, not a cost to them.
Great. Mohammed.
Well, I mean, it can be done, and we have more work to do, but what we need is also to almost like bring these examples, showcase positive bodies. A lot of what we see in the media is people needing help, but we also need to portray people who are making a difference, people with disabilities, I think.
Jamie?
I agree on the last point. We're working in very different types of countries, different environments, and we need to be mindful of that. I would say one final thing, which is sort of the paratransit in the developing world countries, the sort of quasi-legal public transport systems, the shared motorbike and the paratransit as defined perhaps in other parts of the world. Those two can play a very similar role, but coming at it from very different areas. And it comes back to the point I was saying earlier on of providing access for all, but not necessarily within every single mode of transport, but finding the relevant transport systems that are available.
Daniela?
Yeah, two things very quickly. The first one, we should train those who collect specific official data on how to ask the questions depending on the country and the culture they're interacting with, so that the questions can't be asked directly, particularly in those countries that have disabilities, but by asking the questions in a certain way, we can figure it out. It has been done, I think, of India. Second, sport. Somebody mentioned the Olympics in London 2012. I think that we could use actually these events and these situations. Think of Tokyo 2020 and more, and the World Cup 2022 in Doha, etc., as a way of stimulating thinking about transportation to be accessible and affordable. This could be an interesting way of doing things where everybody is really interested in participating.
Nite.
All right. One is most of them were comments, but the challenge, which is not okay, yeah, it is a challenge really, is that we are dealing with issues that are not subject to quantification. So when you're talking about cost-benefit analysis and you put in the market, though, I mean, it's like things that are, you can't talk about inclusion or exclusion and talk about the market. So that's a challenge that I leave on the table.
So I'm going to close and thank you all very much for coming and say that I think that clearly there's a lot happening, but there's a lot more that needs to happen. And I think the point around coordination is an extremely important one. I think the point around collecting more data that is disaggregated by disability is important. I think shifting mindsets, not just of policymakers, but maybe of some of us ourselves, and thinking about this in a more robust fashion. I think the point that Janet mentioned around looking at international standards is a useful one for us to consider. And then I think many of the speakers talked about the importance of having certainly a person-focused, people-focused way of doing business, but really looking at persons with disabilities as agents of change. And then, just thinking about how we can continue to build the analytics around this. So thank you very much. And I hope that this is the beginning of a longer conversation. Thank you.